Morning to you. It's good afternoon here. I hope you can see my screen now. I will be trying to make sense of what is quite a confusing picture today, looking at the outlook for oil and meal markets. So I'm going to start by looking at what's been happening to bean prices going back to the beginning of last year. And what you will see on the left, I do 3 different prices. I'm doing them in dollars per bushel. The green line is Brazil, Paranaguá, FOB price. The black line is US Gulf, and the blue line is Iowa. First of all, you can see that prices roughly doubled from around the midpoint of last year. And in particular, you'll see, first of all, Brazil shot ahead of US FOB prices from the Gulf, which was all to do with Chinese buying. Then things came a bit more back to normal, and the Gulf prices in black moved up above, but maybe in some ways a sign of the change in the nature of the market is the Iowa discount on the Gulf price has become much narrower recently, showing something about the tightness in the US market. I thought just for the heck of it on the right, I would add Chinese prices, Dalian prices for imported beans to the diagram. So I've got Paranaguá, I've got US Gulf, and then way up at the top, Dalian. And they move together pretty much, but you can see that Chinese prices are way, way higher than those in the world market. And you might have thought prices of $25 a bushel would encourage more plantings, but don't forget that the prices of the grains are also very high. Right now, the corn price in China is around $12 a bushel, which interestingly is much above, 20% above local wheat prices. So farmers, when they're making their decisions and helped by the government, have right now planted corn rather more than beans. So high prices in China don't mean lots more plantings. It just means it's very expensive. If we now turn to the two products, you can see the contrast between, on the left, what's been happening to meal prices. I have FOB Brazil in black, I have the US prices in green, and then up at the top, we have Chinese soybean meal prices. These are in dollars per metric ton. If we compare, this only goes back more or less 13, 14 months to May. That was when everything started to take off. US and Brazil meal prices are roughly 30% higher than back at the start of the run-up. Chinese prices are 40% higher. But when you go to the right-hand slide, you can see in that diagram, oil prices in many markets have doubled or even more than doubled. If we look at Brazil in black, it went from $600 to $1,300 per metric ton. If we look at China, it went from under 800 to about 1,400. But the real boom has been in the US. US prices have shot up from 600 to over 1,400. And these are way above the Brazilian values, and they are even slightly above Chinese values. There is no doubt that after a brief period when Chinese buying made Brazil short of beans for crushing and Brazilian oil prices went well above US, the US is now taking the lead, and this is all really to do with what's going on in biodiesel and renewable diesel. You may note, actually, if you look, The Chinese oil prices are no higher than US. The meal prices are considerably higher, but in Chinese terms, the lack of extra oil price markup, if you like, on the world, that is what's been putting Chinese crush margins under pressure right now. So oil is the leader. Meal has stabilized. We saw earlier bean prices have stabilized. It's oil that's leading the way. And this is where it's reflected in the oil share of oil and meal values using the seed bot contracts for beans, oil and meal, the standard hedged margin on the crush. And you can see the red line is the share of value that is oil. And the big question, whoops, that everyone asks is, will oil become the lead product, taking over half of the product values from the crush, at least in the States? It's worth noting that in some markets, and the best example is India, exporting meal and importing oil, oil is way above half of the value. So in Indian terms, soybean is now definitely an oil crop. And it could go higher. So let's look at now what's happening broadly to soybean supply demand, not just in the US, although I'll come back to that, but globally. So I'm going to start, because a jolly good way to begin, in my view, is what WASDE says. The WASDE forecasts are pretty representative of what the world feels is the balance in the market. So let's start just by looking at production. And I'm looking in this table, the final figures for the 2018-19 crop. These are in millions of tons. Oops. Then I have 2019-20. And then I have the initial forecast back in May 2020. And then the latest, more or less, final estimate for July this year. So this is spanning a period of 14 months from May last year, July this year. If you look at the world total of production, it's hardly changed. It's gone from just under 363 million to just above. So there's no real change in world production in total. There have been droughts, there have been all kinds of problems. Argentina has been most badly affected, but the Brazil upside, going from 131 to 137 million metric tons, has offset the fall in the Argentine crop. The droughts, the freeze that we also know about, they have really affected the follow-on crops, the grain crops, the safrinha rather than the soybean in Brazil. It's now affecting apparently the cane crop in Brazil. But beans were fairly immune from this. If we look at the estimate for next year, WASDE, and I think that's probably accepted, is there'll be another increase of slightly over 20 million metric tons. US is going back up, but interestingly, you'll see it's not quite as high as it was back in 2018-19. Brazil is growing yet again. The assumption is Argentina gets back to something more like normal. And so the world as a whole is expected right now to be up. And I suppose you might have thought that when the South American farmers are deciding, they've had problems with grains this year, so maybe they will continue to like soybeans when they come to the soy plantings. Now you'll remember that I said that over the course of 20 to 21 crop year, from May last year to July this year, the estimate of world production grew by very, very little. It was flat. Let's look at the crushing estimate, and we can see the world, whoops, the top row, and then we can see how it changed in the course of the estimates for the current crop year. And what you can see there is that the big change is that during the period since May last year, the world crush is estimated to have increased by nearly 10 million metric tons, from 312.8 to 322. US hardly changed. Brazil crept up. Argentina went down. The big changes were in China and in the rest of the world. But in total, the crush increased by nearly 10 million metric tons, while the output didn't grow. That's important to remember. Actually, at one point, the expectation was for an even higher number in China, put at 100 million metric tons. But the outbreak of African swine fever and the shift towards wheat rather than corn as a feed grain, and feed wheat, it's got better protein, so you use less meal in the feed mix. As a result, they've downgraded in the end the Chinese crush to 96 million. It's still growing, but not by quite as much. For this year, the expectation is US will creep up a bit, Brazil will creep up a bit, Argentina creep up a bit, China creep up by more, and the world will rise by another 10 million metric tons. So remember, crush is up 10 million in the world, output hasn't changed. And this is putting a squeeze on stocks, because as the crush went up and production estimates didn't, there is a reduction in stocks. And you can see this looking, first of all, globally at the top row. Ending stocks for the world, I don't know why this keeps moving, I'm not touching it. Ending stocks for the world were actually originally expected to rise slightly from previous year to May estimate for the current crop year. And they've downgraded it over the course of 2021 by about 7 million metric tons. And they expect it to rise a bit in the next crop year, the WASDE people. If we look at Brazil, actually the stocks compared with 2019-20 are expected to be higher in 2021 and rise a little bit more in 21-22. Argentine stocks originally were meant to rise a bit, they're down a bit and be static in 21-22. China has been increasing steadily its stocks. It massively overbought actually from Brazil. I've shown you that the crush has been slightly downgraded for China and it's ending up in stocks. The US has had to bear the brunt. The US is where the adjustment in world stocks occurred. And you can see, if we look along the row for the US, at the end of 18-19, US stocks were nearly 25 million tons. At the end of 1920, they'd fallen 10 million to just over 14 million tons. During the course of the current crop year, they have dropped from 11, was the original estimate, down to less than 4 million. And it's hardly expected to rise in the course of 21-22. The US, nowhere else, the US is seeing a massive squeeze on stocks, and no surprise, and you saw it in the Iowa prices, US bean prices are steaming ahead above the rest of the world. I mean, China is normally high, but the US has really increased. And you can see this when we look at the US alone, the US market balance alone. Output fell in 1920. It's recovered in 2021. In 21-22, it's expected almost to be back to where it was in 18-19. The crush has hardly increased. It's crept up. The crush, although there's good demand for oil, the crush has only increased slightly. Interestingly, the US has taken a lead in exports. You can see exports went in 1920 from 45.8 million tons. The latest estimate for the 2020-21 crop year is 61.8, a jump of 16 million metric tons. So crush wasn't up much, output was up, but the net effect has been to pull ending stocks down from 14 million at the end of 1920 to 3.7 million at the end of this latest crop year. And actually, you might have expected the crush to be higher, but there isn't enough capacity. The world is demanding, or US biodiesel producers are demanding soy oil because thanks to COVID, availability of animal fats, availability of recycled cooking oil, availability of technical corn oil from the ethanol blended with the gasoline, which has been down in use, all of that is down, putting pressure on the availability of soy oil. But the US wasn't able to crush much more. And in the meantime, a lot has been exported. So the US has really taken the brunt of the fall in global ending stocks. So let's look at the lead product, the oils. And as I say here, biofuels are leading the way. I want to show you here what has happened. I hope you're familiar with this idea of RINs, the tradable certificates for the different mandates in the renewable fuel standard in the US. And it's great, it gives us a price at which the market is valuing these biofuels. Now, the US is, like most biofuel mandates, very complicated, but the US is particularly complicated. There is the biodiesel mandate that, if you follow these things, gives you D4 RINs. There are other biofuel mandates, of which by far the most important is the one for corn ethanol, D6 RINs. And in addition, and of growing importance, is the low carbon fuel standard in California, now Oregon, coming in Washington State, and probably it's in British Columbia, in Canada. It'll probably be copied elsewhere, which is putting pressure on the sellers of transport fuel to blend with low carbon alternative fuels, notably biofuels. What I show you here is, I've put ethanol here for an important reason. Ethanol is the green line, and I've done it in values of the RINs per gallon of biodiesel, not per gallon of ethanol. That's because I want to compare it with biodiesel. Biodiesel has higher energy value than ethanol, and so per gallon of biodiesel, the ethanol RINs become more valuable. The black line is the biodiesel RINs, measured on the left in cents per gallon of biodiesel. They rose to roughly 300 cents or $3 per gallon of biodiesel, which is a hell of a lot. The blue line is simply added to show you how you can interpret that in cents per pound of soy oil. It tells you how much the biodiesel mandate has added to the underlying value of soy oil. At the peak, it was 40, that's on the right, 40 cents per pound. It's currently trading around 32, 33 cents per pound of soy oil. But that is all adding to the value of soy oil in the market. People are willing to pay for this in biodiesel. On top of that, there is still $1 a gallon blending tax credit for the use of biodiesel, which is roughly, if you think in, I'm changing units, if you're thinking not of dollars a gallon, but in values per metric ton, that's nearly $300. So biofuels are adding tremendously to the value of the soy oil, which is a major feedstock for biodiesel. The biofuel market is essential in understanding what's been going on in vegetable oils. And the first thing which I feel is slightly surprising is that even with exceptionally high biofuel prices, countries with biodiesel mandates have stuck to them. They have not changed them. The only flexibility that we've seen in mandates has been in South America, in Argentina, and in Brazil. And Brazil, having cut its mandate, is now going back towards its full mandate. The two biggest markets for biodiesel, the EU and the US, they actually try to encourage what they call low carbon feedstocks like used cooking oil, like animal fats. They also allow some flexibility between biofuels. But I've shown you, I've mentioned that already that the US allows a fairly transparent way to see how the different biofuels compete. And the US has ended up being caught in a dilemma. The most important mandate is for corn ethanol, which mandates 15 billion gallons of ethanol to be blended in gasoline. Then there's a biodiesel mandate, which currently is 2.43 billion gallons of biodiesel. And then there's a category called advanced undifferentiated biofuels with a mandate of nearly 600 million gallons of biodiesel. The important thing to know is that if you can't meet the other mandates with other feedstocks, then you may use biodiesel. Corn ethanol may only be used to meet the 15 billion gallon corn ethanol mandate. And then there are these state policies led by California, which are imposing reductions in the carbon intensity of fuel every year. Very complicated. But remember, there is an corn ethanol mandate and biodiesel, which actually could meet any of the three mandates if needed. But to make it more complicated, there are blend rules. Car manufacturers, engine manufacturers have set a limit of 10%, which the federal government supports, on the blending of ethanol with gasoline. There is a limit of 5% on the blending of first generation biodiesel, fatty acid methyl ester, with diesel. renewable diesel, which is made from oils and fats and is just like diesel in its blending properties, has no blend wall. That's important because blend walls are screwing things up. For the corn ethanol mandate of 15 billion gallons, it can't be met in full with corn ethanol, because if you used it all, you would have to be blending more than 10% in ethanol. And 10% is the limit. As a result, some biodiesel goes into the corn ethanol mandate. And the earlier diagram I showed you, and you can have a copy of the presentation afterwards, shows that the RIN values for corn ethanol mandate and for the biodiesel mandate are now very close. That is because biodiesel has to be used to meet the last gallon of the corn ethanol mandate. Then we come to California. In California, they are limited in ethanol by the 10% blend wall. They are limited in biodiesel by the 5% blend wall for fatty acid methyl ester. They have to use lots of renewable diesel to meet their obligations. In fact, in some periods, I've calculated California is above 20% biodiesel and renewable diesel in its blend in diesel.
James, we have a couple of minutes left.
Sorry, okay, I'll be as quick as I can. That is what screwed things up. So, biofuels have been creating a demand which is very heavy for the vegetable oils to supply. And this is when the supply of oils other than soybean has been hit by bad weather for palm oil. And the Malaysians make it worse by limiting the number of foreign workers who are vital for their plantations. As a result, Malaysia is now facing its lowest output for over a decade. Palm oil can no longer meet the bulk of the growth in vegetable oil demand. When we go to the seed oils, rapeseed canola had a bad crop. The one possible upside is sunflower oil will increase this year, but the greatest hope for increased vegetable oil supply is going to be soybean, but you need to get extra crush. And the Chinese are currently reluctant to crush much more because they're using feed wheat rather than corn in their feed mixture. If we turn to soy meal demand, if you look at this diagram, which shows for the different major markets and for the world, the expectations of annual growth. And you can see if we look at the right, the growth in meal demand is meant to be slipping. This is soy meal demand. And what does that mean? Because meal is typically the major product, there will be less soy oil produced as well. So to tie it together, what can we say about prices? If we look at the long run trend in prices on the left, you can see that the long run trend has been down, and this is for soybeans. These are real prices, inflation adjusted. However, the right takes that long run trend in orange, but it shows you monthly prices. Monthly prices are way above their long run trend. Here, I show you for all an assembly of the major agricultural products, how their current prices, or at least the June prices, related to their long run trends. Which were the highest above their trend? Soy oil and palm oil. If you take the long run trends for 60, 70 years, soy was the highest, palm next highest, and corn was very close to palm. Soybean pulled up by oil was also far above trend. Then you get wheat and so on. Oils are leading the way in the agricultural complex. High prices don't last forever. Usually inflation catches up with them. And so it might be expected that oil's prices, which have gone highest, would have the furthest to fall. But biofuels, blend walls in the US, they are creating wonderful opportunities for renewable diesel to catch the growth in biofuel demand. And it's not just US, also in Europe. That is why I believe soy oil and other oils will defy gravity and remain above trend for as long as governments are committed to biofuels. Eventually, meal, like the grains, should return to its price trend. When, or as I say, should it be if, crops get back to normal yields. But soybeans, because it's got the high value of oil, is going to lie somewhere in between. It'll end up, I believe, above trend because the oil share is pulling it higher. So sorry for running over. Thank you very much indeed. And I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, James. Again, outstanding presentation highlighting the importance of what's happening on the vegetable oil segment. And I think it is critical to understand what's happening on vegetable oil because it gives us some guidance on what's going to be happening on soybean meal, which a lot of our customers here are obviously consuming. So in that context, we have seen soybean oil prices rally significantly for the reasons you have outlined. Palm oil as well has been rallying significantly, and we'll not discuss the supply side, but what is going to be stopping or slowing down this rally? What are some of the things that we should be watching out for? And I like to divide the question in two parts, being one, human consumption. To what extent can our consumers pay these prices in developing economies? You know, where is a tier where they say, I can't afford it? And on the biofuel side, which is another huge component, what can happen that could limit that demand or reduce that demand? Or is there any possibility of seeing any demand reduction? I would appreciate that insight. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Carlos. It's a good question and it's difficult to answer. The thing on the food side is we had expected reductions in food demand. I mean, just to give you an idea, at dollars, this is wholesale, dollars per metric ton level, some of the major oils in India are now getting up to $2,000. You know, that's a premium market. It is getting crazy prices. India's not rich. One of the things we've seen, and you can't separate it from COVID, because of lockdowns, because of cutbacks in hospitality, don't forget that restaurants, fast food, they often use the oil for frying more than once. Households do not. So the switch from catering to household may not reduce the overall demand. It seems that the overall demand has not fallen, and because of the change in the balance of demand for vegetable oils. Same in Africa. African imports don't seem really to have fallen. And of course, a lot of oil is used in other products, so that you don't feel the vegetable oil price as much as we see it in the market. I had expected, to be honest, that it would be biofuels that adjusted. I had thought that biofuel policies, governments might have shown flexibility. If we look at the previous times of high prices, it did. There were buyouts. You could, when the price got above so much, you could pay not to meet the mandate. Doesn't happen this time. The commitment to biofuels seems so strong that The one adjustment factor I had expected has not adjusted. So we really need to have more production rather than weakening of demand to bring the market back into a nice balance.
Excellent, James. And I guess if you are a soybean meal buyer, these is actually a good situation for you. I know that as a feed formulators and feed consumers in this audience that we have, we hear about and we know about higher commodity prices. It is interesting that soybean meal is one of the commodities, not many, that actually have been down in price since January 1st of this year compared to other alternatives. So clearly interesting to review the formulations that we have in the ration. James, one last question, and it comes from the audience. We are short in time, but it is really interesting to find out. In Spanish, we have the term aceitero for a crusher, which means oiler. Literal translations on oiler, which was at the beginning of our history. We used to crush for oil. Oil was the primary driver. And the question that we have here is, it's an anonymous attendee, says, do you see soybeans becoming an oil rather than a meal crop? I think it's interesting. I leave that for your closing remarks.
For my closing remarks, the first answer is it depends where you are. In India, it is already an oil crop. So you have to look for each country at their trade position and therefore the relative prices of the oil and meal. I believe, in the light of what I've been saying so far, the growth in renewable diesel demand, a lot of which is going to have to be met by soy oil, that we are likely to settle at a high oil share. The interesting thing will be, what do the seed breeders, the seed companies do? Will they try harder? They've looked in the past, a higher oil soybean. That in some ways, if with their box of tricks, it would be lovely if they could do that, because today that is what the world is craving. It's not yet there, but certainly some markets are going to become an oil rather than a meal-driven crop.
Excellent, James. So that's very insightful. I appreciate your comments. We certainly need to produce more. We need to crush more, let alone we need to do it sustainably. And that's not easy to do for all origins. Obviously, USEC, after being working very hard on sustainable soy assurance protocol, we have reached the 100 million metric ton mark, sustainable soy assurance protocol. So very valuable for us and a distinguishing factor for US soy. Thank you, James. Very glad to see you and best of luck. And we'll be in touch soon, as always.
Bye.
Gerardo, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Carlos. Mil gracias al doctor Fry. Siempre muy preciso, siempre muy vasto en la información. Ya lo veíamos en las preguntas. Ojalá que nos sigan enviando sus preguntas para continuar con el programa y no lo dejen al final para poderlas ir agrupando y tratar de sacar la mayor ventaja de esto. Mil gracias por la moderación, Carlos. Tenemos a continuación a meteorólogo Drew Lerner. Ya habíamos anticipado su breve bio. Y tan solo mencionar, Carlos, se nos han sumado varios amigos, Venezuela, Perú, varias localidades en México en lo particular. Hay un saludo muy especial de don Leonel en Monterrey. Saludos a la quinceañera en este aniversario de 15 años de usted que compartíamos. Gracias a todos. Ese aniversario no sería posible sin el concurso de todos ustedes, todas sus empresas. Drew, vamos entonces con tu presentación. Al término tenemos las preguntas y respuestas con Carlos de nuevo. Gracias.
All right. Well, whoops. I guess I haven't shared my screen, so let me back up here. Try that again. All right. All right. Very good. Okay. Well, the need for some kind of change in world weather is probably on the rise right now because of some ongoing concerns that we all have about the short ending stocks that are present around the world. And certainly the weather is going to have a huge factor in that. I do want to spend just a quick moment before we go forward and just point out that we do have a daily podcast that's free. If you want to take that address down and check us out on a regular basis, that podcast occurs every morning. Usually around 7 a.m. Central Daylight Time in the U.S. So with that said, we will move on here. I want to show a little bit of a comparison to the current drought in North America to that which occurred in 2003, because it was during that time period that we saw an equal amount of the continent suffering from drought. And on this chart, you can see in February of 2003, there was quite a bit of drought that was present across the west and north parts of the continent, from Mexico all the way up into the U.S. West and north central parts of the U.S., as well as a part of Canada. And then by the end of the growing season, back in September of 2003, there was obviously very little change in the overall status of drought, except in Mexico, where there was some improvement that took place. The bottom charts show this year, and you can see that there's a lot of similarities to 2003. And just to point out that Mexico's drought that had been quite extreme earlier this year has become much better. It's not over in all areas, but we are seeing some improved moisture in many locations. It's still quite dry in the Northwest. But again, this reiterates our point about 2003. 2003 is one of three comparable years that we are using to help us make good forecasts for the coming several months in North America, and for that matter, around the world. I am going to focus on the North America situation over these next few minutes, just simply because it's the only place in the world where drought is as serious as it is, and where there's the biggest debate about the ending stock. So we'll stay focused on the U.S. Quite a bit here. You're looking at percentage of normal precipitation charts for the past 90 days. And I just wanted to point out two primary areas of interest. The first is in the U.S. lower and eastern Midwest, where the percentage of normal precipitation has been very good, very close to normal, if not a little bit above normal in the most recent 90-day period. But in contrast to that, the northern plains and the upper Midwest has been notably drier biased, with notable moisture deficits occurring across that area. And because of that, there's obviously all this talk about lower production numbers for both corn and soybeans in the Dakotas, Minnesota, parts of Iowa, and neighboring areas, both up into Canada and also into Iowa and Nebraska. I guess I said Iowa already, but anyway, you can see that in the past few months, there has been a very definite tendency here for less than usual precipitation to occur in that part of the U.S. Soil moisture in the absolute sense right now is basically rated very short across the northern plains and the upper Midwest. Those areas are going to continue to be dry biased. This fits very well again with that 2003 comparison that we showed. And notice the good moisture that's present in the central and eastern parts of the Midwest, as well as the southern states, the lower Mississippi River Basin area and the southeastern states. Having moisture that is this prevalent at this time of year is a very good omen for soybean development. A lot can go wrong in the last few weeks of the growing season, but right now, as we finish out July, the soil moisture profile looks very good. And only the far northwesternmost parts of the U.S. production area has really had persistent dryness and is still fighting that moisture shortage today. The other factor to note here is the temperatures over the last 30 days, or actually for the month of July. Temperatures have been cool on average. And now it's hot right now in parts of the U.S., but up until this week, temperatures have been cooler than usual. And that has helped to conserve that moisture, while precipitation was sometimes a little on the light side. But having cool weather around is a good thing in conserving the moisture, as long as the soybeans get a period of warm weather in August. Now, just north of the border in the soybean and corn producing areas of Manitoba and portions of Saskatchewan, there's obviously still a problem with dryness there as well. This is ongoing for 4 years now in parts of those two provinces. But the situation this year became much worse because temperatures rose well above average, and the moisture profile has been struggling most of the season. Now, here recently, they did get some rain, but it has not occurred in the heart of Saskatchewan. And the rains that have occurred in Manitoba have been a little bit limited. It looks like the situation should be better, but the problem in Canada has been the persistent hot temperatures. And because there were such significant moisture deficits at the beginning of the growing season, getting a little bit of rain while temperatures are hot isn't sufficient enough, and crop stress continues to be a serious situation. Now, Canada is forecast to continue to see less than normal rainfall, not only over the next 10 days, but really for much of the month of August. So the stress in eastern late summer crop areas of Manitoba and Saskatchewan will be fairly high. There will also be ongoing problems in southern parts of Alberta. And these areas not only produce corn and soybeans, but they produce a lot of canola as well. And the canola in Canada has suffered big time this year so far because of the same problems with the ongoing drought and the heat. And there is not any good reason to expect the crop to finish out any different than it has been so far this season. In other words, it will continue to be drier and warmer biased relative to normal. These three charts represent our analog years, our comparative years that we're using in general for this year. And the years are 1985 in the upper right-hand corner, 2003 in the lower left corner, and 1967. Now, these are what the upper air wind flow pattern looked like in each of those 3 August seasons for those years. And what I want you to look at most focused on here is the left-hand side of the page, where 2003 and 1967 are presented. These were the upper air wind flow patterns in those 2 years, and they are quite comparable to what is expected to occur in August of this year. 1985 didn't fit very well, and the difference is that 1985 was a La Nina year the entire growing season, whereas this year our La Nina ended in January or February, and we have had neutral ENSO conditions ever since. Well, notice the two maps on the left-hand side, and notice how similar they are, and then look at what is predicted to occur in August. The next 30 days coming up, it will have a very similar signature with the upper air wind flow, a ridge of high pressure expected over Western North America. This will limit the amount of rain that can occur in Canada's prairies, as well as the northern U.S. plains, and probably a portion of the western U.S. corn and soybean producing areas. But also this flow pattern will also bring cooler air into the eastern parts of the U.S. Midwest at times during August, and so they will not see the kind of heat that Canada and parts of the northern plains will have. And without the heat, they will have a better chance of conserving that moisture in the soil, and yields are likely to continue to be very good. By the way, these charts, if you're not familiar with them, they represent the upper air wind flow pattern. And so the wind occurs from left to right following the lines. So if you are in Montana, if you're a parcel of air, you're going to move southeast from Montana down into the heart of the Midwest in a northwest flow. These charts here are all percentage of normal precipitation charts for the summer months, June, July, and August, of each of those analog years that I presented on the previous slide. And I want you to notice the dry bias that was present in June and July throughout Canada. Most of the southern production areas in Canada in 1985, 2003, and 1967 were all notably drier biased years. And so we thought this was very interesting because that has been the case this year as well. So the parallel with these years is very solid. On the far right-hand side is the month of August. And I want you to notice that there's a little more deviation amongst the 3 years. The 1967 and 2003 years seem to be very similar in the sense of extending the drier bias in Canada another 30 days. But in 1985, that was not the case, and it rained across much of the prairies. But the biggest difference about 1985 and these other 2 years is the fact that there was a strong La Nina in place, and we do not have a strong La Nina right now. So for that reason, we're going to toss out 1985, but we'll continue to show some comparisons here. These charts show what happened in July of each of the 3 years. These are composites that take the average temperature for all 3 years for the month of July and present a new average. And the same thing on precipitation as a percentage of normal. Notice that in all 3 years, there was a cooler than normal tendency for temperatures in the Midwest, the Delta and the southeastern states. And there was also a tendency for below normal precipitation to occur in the Western Corn Belt and the northern U.S. plains, while wet weather occurred in the southeastern U.S. and the eastern Corn Belt. The bottom 2 charts show what we have done so far this month as of last Friday. And notice that there is a lot of similarity in the temperatures, but the precipitation is not quite the same with a smaller area of below normal precipitation. Now that was through last Friday. If we were to add in some of the weather since then, that dry bias might expand just a little bit. But my point here is that using these 3 years as comparative years will be very helpful in determining how we're going to end the growing season. So this is the month of August. And I want you to see what happened in those 3 years in the month of August. Notice the huge area of cooler than usual temperatures again occurring in the majority of the Midwest corn and soybean producing areas. And also notice that there's a tendency for below normal precipitation to occur across a big part of the northwestern part of the production area, including Iowa, Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Nebraska. The rest of the production area has done or did very well in those 3 years. And so this is very similar to what we think will happen this month coming up, especially since the upper air wind flow pattern is expected to match that of these other 3 years. Now we're going to take a moment and look at ocean surface temperature data. The oceans have a big influence on weather around the world. And there's some areas we want to pay attention to just for a moment. And there's a lot of detail here and we don't have much time. But I want to point out the ocean temperature anomalies that are around the North American continent. In the top chart, these are the actual anomalies that are present today. So there's an area of warmer than usual ocean water temperature off the northwestern U.S. coast, extending well out into the Pacific. While off the lower U.S. coast and off the northern Mexico coast, there's a cooler than usual temperature bias there. In the meantime, if you look in the equatorial region of the Pacific inside the red box, you'll notice the temperatures are fairly neutral there. There's no warmer or cooler than normal anomaly of significance in that box. That's why we don't have a La Nina right now. That is where La Nina and El Nino are determined, and with the temperatures near normal, there is neither at work. And then the other area to look at is in the Atlantic. Inside the black box across the Atlantic Ocean, notice the temperatures right now are not all that anomalous either. Now the bottom chart shows how those ocean temperatures have been changing in the last few weeks. And I want you to notice, first of all, that the The warm pool of water off the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. is not changing a lot, but there's a little bit of a tendency for cooling to take place there. There's a greater area of cooling that's occurring off the lower U.S. West Coast. And there's also a little bit of cooling showing up in the equatorial region of the Pacific Ocean in the red box. And that cooling there is very important because it hints at the potential for La Nina to maybe develop later this year. And that will have a big influence on North American weather over the next several months. In the Atlantic, notice the cooling that's taking place. The blue color there in the black box in the bottom chart shows that the ocean is cooling down. As the ocean cools, it'll become less supportive of tropical cyclone development. So we may actually finish out the hurricane season this year with a lighter or lower number of tropical cyclones impacting the U.S. In the meantime, this is a computer forecast that NOAA has over the potential for La Nina or El Nino to develop. And notice the heavy dashed black line is below the purple line, which means that the ocean temperature anomalies in that equatorial region of the Pacific are actually predicted to turn cooler additionally from the trend that I've already shown you on the last slide. So the model says that we're going to continue cooling and that the potential for us to develop into a La Nina is very good as we go through the fourth quarter of this year. And that will have a big influence on North American weather, not only finishing out this growing season, but over the winter and into the spring of 2022 as well. And with La Nina being a world weather influencer, it will have a lot to say about weather in the rest of the world as well. So we'll be watching this. It probably won't have a big influence before we get to October, but maybe some in late September. Now, last slide here, or at least this next slide here, was a study that we did last winter showing how weather in North America deviates from normal in a year where we go from a La Nina in January to no La Nina and no El Nino in the heart of the summer season, which has happened over the past few months. We were in La Nina in January. We're now in neutral ENSO conditions. And inside the blue boxes there, I've highlighted some areas. One is in the upper Midwest, one is in the Ohio River Valley, another is in the Northern Plains and Rocky Mountain region. And in those blue boxes, these are rankings of rainfall out of 121 years of data. The Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, upper Midwest, and the Northern Plains have all ranked very low in rainfall in the month of August in all three of our, or all five of these years that we were looking at. And the point of this is that the month of August, there's a tendency for less than normal precipitation to still occur in that upper Midwest, Northern Plains, and on this particular chart, even parts of the Ohio River Valley. That reinforces all this other data that we've showed today that suggests that there should be support for less than normal precipitation in many of the areas that have already been seeing it over the past few months. And then lastly, on the ocean temperatures out there off the West Coast, one of the things that we were concerned about was that the cooling that was occurring last spring off the West Coast of North America supports what we call the negative phase of Pacific Decatal Oscillation. Now, that's a lot of word there. The only thing you need to know is that when the water temperatures are colder than normal off the West Coast of North America, it tends to make the central part of the U.S. hot and dry during the summer months. Now, the point of this chart here on the right-hand side at the top there is that the cooling that's underway right now is, even though it's an area of cooling, we are not as cool in the Eastern Pacific Ocean as we were last spring. And so the bottom line is that we are not getting influence from this phenomenon. So as we go forward in time, this Pacific Decatal Oscillator, even though it's negative right now, and that's representing the cooler ocean water temperatures, it will not be a factor from August of this year in U.S. North America weather in general. So, but The reason why I make mention of it is it will be a factor in 2022. We expect this, that ocean cooling off the west coast of North America to be much more significant as we go through the winter and the spring months. And that in conjunction with La Nina will likely create some greater anomalies of significance. One of the things that happens when we have the negative phase of PDO is that we get less than normal rain in the U.S. plains, the southwestern U.S., even portions of northern Mexico, and even the southeastern part of the U.S. During the winter months. And when this happens at the same time that La Nina occurs, the two reinforce each other, and these anomalies become much more significant. So as we go through the autumn and into the spring of next year, we could very well be faced with a more notable dry problem in the central part of the U.S., but not for the balance of this year, this year's growing season. These are temperature anomalies over the coming 2 weeks. On the left-hand side is the first week of the outlook ending August 3rd. Notice the cool weather expected in the Midwest and the warm weather in Canada and the northwestern United States. In the second week of the forecast ending August 10th, it's going to be very warm in the U.S. central and northern plains, the northwestern part of the Corn Belt, and on into Canada. Temperatures in the eastern U.S. will be more seasonable in the second week. Rainfall potentials, the green color here would be above average precipitation, the yellow would be below normal. And notice here that there's really not much of a trend here to grab onto. There is normal to below normal precipitation advertised for the eastern Midwest in particular, and a slight bias for below normal precipitation in the northwestern Corn Belt and northern plains. You might be noticing too, Mexico is expected to see less than usual precipitation over these 2 weeks, but it will not be dry. There will be precipitation coming on at some point. So here's the official forecast for the next 60 days. The chart on the left-hand side is for July 15th through August 15th. Notice the below average precipitation bias still prevailing in a part of the Corn Belt, especially the Northwest. Notice the warm temperatures in the northwestern Corn Belt too. Weather in the eastern Midwest will be more normalish, where the temperatures will be closer to normal and the precipitation will be a little below average, but is still very well timed precipitation. And then on the chart on the right-hand side is for August 16th to September 15th. And notice here that, again, temperatures are going to be fairly seasonable across the production region, with the exception of the northwestern Corn Belt, where it will still be a little warm biased. And notice the precipitation will be below normal in the western part of the Corn Belt and the plains as well, but fairly normal elsewhere. The bottom line to this is that what we're saying here is that there's a pretty darn good chance that we're going to finish out the growing season in the U.S. in mostly good shape, with good yields coming out of most of the soybean country and the corn areas. The exception will be in the northwest U.S. plains, where there will be a problem with dryness, as well as Canada's prairies and the northwestern Corn Belt, Minnesota, parts of Iowa, and portions of South Dakota in particular. Those areas, along with a few spots in Nebraska, will probably have some stress and probably lose a little yield potential. But very good production is likely to come from the rest of the growing area. Now, for the early part of the harvest season, as we go from mid-September to mid-October, we expect to see a relatively normal distribution of rain. The temperatures are going to be cool in the east and warm in the west. Now, with La Nina possibly developing, excuse me, if La Nina develops and the negative PDO prevail, we may actually see a warmer and a drier bias in the harvest season than what you see here. I just wasn't convinced yet that that was for sure where we were going to go, but these charts will probably be updated with a turn towards a drier and a warmer scenario. So it should be a good harvest season, and our beans should finish out very well, with the exception of the northwestern part of the production area. In Canada, it's going to be status quo for the next 60 days. Where there's going to be an ongoing below normal precipitation bias for the first 30 days in the same areas that have been dry. So no changes in Canada. until we get into the August 16th to September 15th time period. And then they'll start seeing some improved rainfall, but it's too late in their growing season to make a big difference to their production in canola, and maybe too late for some of the corn and soybeans as well. Frost and freeze season will begin as we finish the end of August and move into September. So their growing season's running out of time for any kind of improvement this year. We've already talked about the tropical cyclones being fewer in number this year. I'm expecting 15 named storms, but that actually may be a little too high if we continue to cool down the Atlantic Ocean water. And this is somewhat important too, because if there's less tropical cyclones in the southeastern United States, there's a chance that that area might dry down a little bit quicker than it would otherwise. Real quickly, in South America, a very important thing needs to be noted. Now, this is a 6-month departure from normal precipitation, and I want to point out how significantly anomalous the weather has been in Brazil's soybean and corn country. As James already pointed out, the corn crop there, the safrinha crops, are really hurt badly with dryness this year. Part of the soybean growing season turned a little bit light on rain too, but it didn't occur early enough to be a problem. But we have significant moisture deficits out there in parts of Brazil right now. The rainy season doesn't begin until we get to the end of September or October at the very earliest. And the problem is that we've talked about La Nina returning. La Nina will delay some of the precipitation potential for the late September, October time period if it's already beginning to evolve. Now, that may be a little soon. What might happen is they may get a little bit of rain in late September and then kind of dry down a little bit in October and not see better rains until November. And as a result of that, we could end up with a situation where there could be at least a little bit of a dry bias during their spring season if La Nina kicks in significantly. The chart here, the right-hand side of the chart, the blue colors there are below normal precipitation. So we could actually end up with less than normal rainfall in the October through mid-December time period. Now, don't get too far ahead of me. I'm not suggesting they're going to have ongoing drought, but the rain amounts will be less than usual, and the early season rains may not kick in well enough to support a really good production, a very good planting season. We may see some delay in the planting and the early season crop development. Usually in La Nina events, the rains improve in Brazil as we get to the latter part of December and through the summer season, January and February. Quite often, the rainfall is very heavy. So it could be one of those years where the early bean crop gets planted but doesn't do very well for quite a while. And then things will get a lot better down the road. So we'll be watching that. Also, Argentina is a little dry right now, but it could become a lot drier with the development of La Nina. So there could be a little problem with their corn and early season sunseed crop. And usually what happens in Argentina is that seasonal rains improve by the time the soybean planting season begins. And so there's usually not a big problem there until reproduction later in the year, when we end up being a little dry during that period of time. Okay, in the rest of the world, just a couple of quick comments. China has been exceptionally wet for the second year in a row. There have been some epic type flooding that has occurred in both years. This year, the flooding hasn't been as frequent and as widespread as it was last year. Last year, they did get hurt on production of all crops. This year, it's been a better year for the most part. The rapeseed crop production seems to have been better, although still was hindered by too much moisture. And the corn and soybean crops have been bothered by frequent rains recently, but it's been warm for the most part. Just this last week, we had an incredibly great amount of rain that fell in Hebei and parts of Henan, which is in the north central part of China, and some serious flooding occurred, with 30 inches of rain occurring over a single 24-hour period of time, and 40 to 45 inches of rain in a 6-day period, and that just ended earlier this week. So there's a loss of crop in a part of central China, and that is of concern. China's forecast is going to improve, but you can see how wet it's been. Some of those areas have seen more than 4 times the normal amount of rain this particular month. The situation,
Drew, we got a couple of minutes left. Sorry.
Yep, just about done. Southeast Asia, the moisture profile here still very good. The oil palm crop is doing very well. There is a little bit of a decline in precipitations occurring right now, and we will see that perpetuated for a little while. But with La Nina coming on later this year, we'll see much improved rainfall very soon. The moisture profile, though, as of today is not bad. There's no serious stress for any of the oil palm crop there, or coconut for that matter, in neighboring areas. India and mainland areas of Southeast Asia doing okay. It hasn't been the best year for rain across India, but we are seeing a big increase now, and conditions will be much better over the next few weeks. I don't think India's got much to worry about, although the northwest part of India and Pakistan will end up drier biased as we go forward through these next few weeks. And in parts of Europe, situation there is mostly good. No big issues that I can see for their summer crops. So that area is probably fine. And in parts of the former Soviet Union, there are some definite pockets of dryness, but most of the oilseed production areas are doing okay. There is a problem between Ukraine and Kazakhstan where there is a dryness issue underway, and some of the sunseed crop in Kazakhstan and Russia's southern region has performed poorly because of dryness and heat. And lastly here, Australia's canola crop is well established in most of the country, and the outlook for Australia is looking very good with timely precipitation and cool temperatures over the next few weeks, and that should help to set the stage for an excellent start to the growing season. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Carlos and entertain any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you, Drew. Much appreciated. If you could stop sharing your screen, well, perfect. Then I can see you. Good. I had you on another screen, so. But no, it's. Thank you for your presentation. As always, very insightful, and I think I'd like to congratulate you because what you highlighted on our previous session, some of the concerns that we needed to monitor, some of them have materialized and expanded, which is to some of us, I think it's unfortunate to see as the world needs more supply. For our audience, we are recording the event, and we will be posting it in our USEC YouTube channel. And we'll send you that information later on, but it should be available in YouTube later on for the if you have any friends that have that missed a chance to participate. I think Drew, what you highlight is concerning because we are entering, I think, some of the key growing stages for soybeans, right? And August is going to be critical from a weather perspective on determining that yield. I am glad you highlighted the situation on South America. I think we need to closely monitor it. We hope that things develop well, because I think the world needs that supply. And it's going to be critical that to have that supply out of South America. But the U.S., like I said, we're in a very tight stock situation, so we need that. Canola, you highlighted canola. I think it is critical. I think it's critical as you link it to the oil balance sheet, the vegetable oil balance sheet in North America for the reasons that James has highlighted. Reducing that crop or seeing the impact on that crop is going to materially impact the supplies of vegetable oil that are needed in the U.S. from and the world from an industry biodiesel perspective or from a food perspective as well. Some of the questions I think you highlighted them, but I want to emphasize it for the audience is what is the potential of this drought to extend or to continue further in 2022? What would be your perception, your evaluation of the continuation of a similar pattern here?
I am very concerned about that. I actually have created a whole nother PowerPoint. So maybe sometime we can share that. But there's a lot of evidence that we are moving into a period of multi-year drought in North America. And the sad thing is that it's not just a grain and oilseed potential problem. I mean, obviously, there's a huge drought in California. And the water supply is dwindling, and the odds are very high that we're going to see this continued through their wet season in the autumn and winter because of La Nina and because of that negative phase of Pacific Decatal oscillation. So there will be a high potential that we will come into 2022 with worsening drought in the western United States. And as I noted before, the Great Plains and the Western Corn Belt will probably finish out the season with a dry bias. Now, it probably won't seriously hurt a lot of this year's crop, but with La Nina coming in and that negative phase of Pacific Decadal oscillation, that cool water in the eastern part of the Pacific will work together to limit winter precipitation in all of that region. And that means when we come into spring of 2022, we're going to have ongoing moisture deficits in the U.S. plains and in the Western Corn Belt that will set the stage for a real struggle in the spring and summer of 2022. It should also be noted that if La Nina were to prevail through the spring and into summer next year, along with the negative PDO, there's a high correlation with a significant ridge of high pressure over the western part of the Corn Belt in years like that. And so we would come into spring with less moisture in the ground, and we would have a struggle for the whole growing season with below normal precipitation and above normal temperatures. So the bottom line is, yeah, there's a lot of reason to be concerned about North American weather as we move forward. And I should point out, northern Mexico too, the winter for a second year in a row will likely be less than normal rainfall too.
Excellent. Thank you, Drew. Drew, this is maybe a different question, but I get the privilege to ask it because I'm moderating it. I saw an article of the Financial Times, I think it was over the weekend, talking about the weakness of the jet stream in the Northern Hemisphere and the volatility of it, extending the windows of dry weather, extending the windows of wet weather. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but is there something to be mentioned from an overall general perspective on the jet stream, how it's impacting our crops around the world?
Yeah, a couple of things can be said about this. First of all, the jet stream is always weakest in the latter part of the summer. That's normal. And it's really, you have to be kind of careful not to misinterpret that. Sometimes the media can make comments about the weak jet stream and try to make it sound like it's something unusual, or very bad. And it's very normal. But it is responsible for weather patterns to become somewhat persistent. And that's why, it's hard to change a drought when you get to August in North America, or even for that matter, the Northern Hemisphere. You just don't have enough energy in the jet stream to bring a lot of storms in to break down persistent ridges of high pressure or to move persistent low pressure systems out. So it's pretty normal to be in this mode, but it doesn't really spell a lot of potential relief for the areas in North America that are hurting for moisture. But as soon as we go into the autumn and we start getting cooler air to come southward, you'll enhance the jet stream again, and the potential for bringing an end to these persistent patterns will become much better.
Excellent. Thank you. And one last question, and I apologize, we cannot get to all the questions for our audience, but we are limited in time. It's regarding South America. You highlighted the situation on the safrinha, which is actually the big crop, not the small crop. But I think I saw an article of a company importing, I think, close to 30 cargoes of corn, or booking 30 cargoes of corn from Argentina. A flow that typically happens, but 30 cargoes of corn is basically what they do in 1 year. And they've done it in one transaction, which means that Brazil will be importing a lot more corn. I share the same concern with you. on the planting season in Brazil and how that crop develops. Any more insight you can give us on, from a weather perspective, how you see that precipitation outlook, that weather outlook coming into the planting and growing seasons in Brazil?
Yeah, that is a very critical thing. I think the sooner that La Nina starts to evolve, the more trouble that will create for Brazil. So a couple of weeks ago, some of the computer forecast models were suggesting La Nina was going to be aggressive and be already well underway in September. Well, I didn't buy into that, but if it was true, that would be a real threat to Brazil. We could see a repeat of last year where there wasn't, any moisture in late September or October, and everything was seriously delayed. Now, if La Nina is a little slower in evolving so that it comes on in October, there's a better potential that we could see some kind of regular start to rain in late September, and maybe they could get the crops in the ground a little bit better this year, but we might run a little low on moisture as the crop tries to emerge and establish, but it would probably get in the ground a little bit better than it did last year, as long as La Nina doesn't get started too soon. Once La Nina is in place, though, I think it will be destined to see a slow ramping up of seasonal rains, so that November will be the wetter month and October will be kind of a month of erratic rains. And we've had this before, and not every La Nina is the same. Some La Nina years, we get poor rain amounts, but it's well distributed and enough to go ahead and support the planting. And I want to say that's more likely to happen this year than like what happened last year. I don't think we'll see a complete copy of last year. But because we're already so short on moisture, I think it becomes even more important that the rains are not notably below normal, or we will have a little bigger problem if there is a gap in the rains. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment, and we'll have to just watch and see how La Nina evolves over these next few months.
Thank you, Drew. Much appreciated. Great insight. And I think more than any other time, I would like to highlight to our audience the importance of locking supplies, logistical supplies, well ahead of time with a solid counterparty that can accommodate and adjust as needed as supplies get tighter. But you don't have to book the price if you don't believe in price rallies, but I think the logistical supply is very important to lock in. Thank you very much. And Gerardo, I think we're done with our Q&A moderation part, so the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Mil gracias, Carlos, siempre genial. Mil gracias, Drew, genial estos espacios. Creo que todos desearíamos que se pudieran prolongar, pero el tiempo es nuestro mejor amigo para el negocio, para todos los eventos, también nuestro principal reto, y si queremos seguir siendo respetuosos de todo su tiempo que nos hacen favor de dedicarnos. Destacar ahorita nos ha acompañado en el transcurso de la sesión, se fueron sumando, de principio ya estaban, en el ejemplo, don Leonardo Chapula, el líder del área de aceites, con quien compartimos un primer evento virtual y presencial el año pasado, condición híbrida, la semana pasada, el martes, y coincide que están con nosotros también, de principio de la sesión, líderes de las asociaciones, cámaras de aceites en Ecuador, en México. Saludos a los amigos de ahí, y nos han ido acompañando gente de los diferentes sectores y, muy importante, de las diferentes áreas adentro de sus organizaciones. Las áreas de compras que tradicionalmente se imaginaría uno es el primer interesado, pero nos da gusto poder compartir con los líderes de las organizaciones, asociaciones de engordadores, de alimentos balanceados en los diferentes países, y los responsables de nutrición, formulación, como lo son varios de ustedes. Esto nos anima en los esfuerzos de comunicar sobre las ventajas competitivas de la soya, con esa visión holística que hemos venido trabajando en el equipo de USEC para ustedes: compras, nutrición, formulación, cómo evaluar, cómo conocer una materia prima, y consideramos que justo esto empieza a construirse desde los temas que bien nos han compartido el doctor James Fry y el señor Drew Lerner. Clima, movimiento de mercados, cómo afectan nuestros negocios. A todos, mil gracias, sigan con bien. El recordatorio de, pues, por favor, nos hagan la encuesta, que contesten la encuesta que van a recibir vía correo electrónico. El link la pueden contestar, responder, y una vez concluida recibirán el link para descarga de las presentaciones. Caso de que tengan algún inconveniente en ese sentido, nos lo hagan favor de reportar. A Estefanía González, gracias Estefi, que ha sido quien nos ha apoyado en este perfil bajo que caracteriza. Todo esto no sería posible sin Estefanía, gracias a nuestros traductores y el equipo de producción que ha hecho esto posible. Les encargamos la encuesta y sobre todo, sigan con bien, con cuidado. Estamos a la orden. Y